Warning: this video contains graphic content, including details of real-life violence, disturbing subject matter, and sensitive themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You're listening to Descent to Depravity, where we investigate the darkest corners of the human psyche, one chilling story at a time.
Ever been to Gary, Indiana?
No.
I drove through it once, and I think I needed to take an AK-47 with me.
Our kids are dying in the streets.
Dying in the streets, houses, fields of Gary, Indiana, on the way to reclaiming its title as the murder capital of the United States.
Gary, Indiana, a city hammered out of fire and bound together by steel. In 1906, the U.S. Steel Corporation carved it out of the sand along Lake Michigan, a place forged for labor, industry, and the American dream. By the 1950s and 1960s, Gary stood at its height. More than 175,000 people called it home. Steel mills roared day and night, smoke curling into the sky like a promise of endless work. It was the engine of America's growth, a city where paychecks came heavy and steady, where neighborhoods thrived, and downtown pulsed with life. On November 4th, 1957, Eugene Victor Britt was born. He was the second of 6 children in a crowded household where food was stretched thin and affection even thinner. His father, Elmer Britt Sr., existed more as a name than a steady presence, while his mother, Darwin, carried the weight of survival in a place that offered little in return. He had 3 younger sisters, Elizabeth, Brenda Joyce, and Darwin Joanne, the last named after their mother. But the idea of family was little more than a fragile illusion. Before Eugene was born, his mother had already brought 3 other children into the world, each tied to a different father. The home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a patchwork of broken loyalties and divided bloodlines. For Eugene, childhood wasn't about innocence or safety. It was about growing up in the wreckage of other people's choices, a place where neglect festered, and the cracks in the foundation widened into something far more sinister. Elmer Britt, Eugene's father, was 22 when violence first stained the Britt family name. In 1951, he ran down 37-year-old nurse Rose Martha Pruce while fleeing a Gary patrolman. Officer Will Slepsevich had tried to stop him for reckless driving after Elmer nearly clipped his motorcycle, but instead of pulling over, Elmer hit the gas. At the intersection of 6th and Broadway, Rose was struck and left dying in the street. Elmer kept going, smashing into cars as he fled, until police brought him down on the lawn of Gary's public library. He was convicted of reckless homicide and sentenced to 2 to 21 years in prison, the harshest penalty available, but far from justice for the life he had taken. When Elmer stepped out of prison, he marched straight into the steel mills. The work was brutal, but the pay was steady, more than most black men in Gary could dream of. That money gave him comfort, but it never gave him discipline. Elmer drank himself senseless, lied with ease, and chased women without shame. His wife, Darwin, answered his betrayals with her own. What passed for a marriage between them was nothing but open warfare. Their home seethed with infidelity, liquor, and violence, an environment where rage was routine and peace never lasted longer than a bottle. Eugene witnessed everything. At just 5 years old, he stumbled into the bedroom and found his mother in bed with another man. She saw him standing there, eyes wide, and instead of shame, she erupted, screaming, striking, driving him out of the room like he was the one who sinned. Later, she pressed candy into his hands, cheap treats meant to buy silence to bury what he had seen. For Eugene, the lesson was simple. Lies and violence kept the family together. Inside that house on 17th and Madison, there was no refuge. Elmer drank until his temper boiled, then used his fists to make his children and wife submit. He beat them daily, sometimes savagely, and when he wasn't beating them, he was humiliating them. The children grew up forced to watch their mother brutalized, sometimes beaten, sometimes right in front of them. The household was steeped in alcohol, blood, and sex, and those images never left Eugene. His childhood wasn't stolen. It was drowned in abuse until there was nothing left but rage and silence. Eugene inherited his deviance from the one man who should have shown him love and guidance. Elmer Britt, however, did the opposite. He turned violence into instruction, replacing affection with fear, guidance with domination, and left Eugene with a blueprint for sadism that would follow him for life. One day, Eugene hid in a closet in his parents' bedroom during one extraordinarily violent episode of domestic violence. He watched his father beat his mother mercilessly with his fists and feet. Elmer then tied her hands to the bedposts and viciously raped. Eugene's mother bathed him up until he started high school. It is unknown if Darwin ever abused him during these sessions, but if she didn't, someone likely did. As he grew older, Eugene would purposefully hide in the closet to watch his father beat and rape his mother, masturbating through it all. Unfortunately, Eugene was not alone. The 4 Britt children were all exposed to sex and violence. Eugene began to carry out his fantasies on his sisters, and his sisters began having sex with one another. Their parents would regularly catch all of them having sex with each other. Their punishment came in the form of brutal lashings with thick electrical cords, but even the relentless beatings failed to curb their behavior. Eugene's childhood was defined by constant testing, each assessment underscoring his limitations. Between the ages of 9 and 15, his aptitude scores were erratic and discouraging. By 15, though enrolled in the 10th grade, his academic abilities barely reached the level of a second grader. Elmer Sr. dismissed Eugene at every turn. He compared him unfavorably to his other sons, condemning him for what he was not. They were handsome. Eugene was not. They were intelligent. He was not. They had girlfriends. He had none. Elmer drilled into Eugene relentlessly that he would amount to nothing, a verdict repeated until it sank deep into the boy's battered, confused psyche. The rejection was absolute, unrelenting, and it left Eugene hollowed, carrying a quiet rage that would fester for years. By the age of 15, Eugene had enough. Life inside the Britt household was merciless, but the world outside offered no reprieve. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Gary was a city in decay. The steel mills that had once fueled its rise were quiet or shuttered, leaving neighborhoods hollowed and businesses abandoned. White flight emptied middle-class streets, and the city's tax base crumbled along with it. Police departments were understaffed and overwhelmed, struggling to respond to the mounting tide of crime. By 1993 and 1994, Gary had earned the grim title of murder capital of the United States.
They're not safe.
Our kids are dying in the streets.
Dying in the streets, houses, fields of Gary, Indiana, on the way to reclaiming its title as the murder capital of the United States.
I think we're dealing with numbers when we should be dealing with people. People are losing their lives, and we've got into a number count.
But the numbers are so staggering.
That's what it took, so now we on the map. So we like whatever.
You're on the map for murdering them.
So whatever.
In 1993, Gary had more murders per capita, 109 among its 119,000 residents, than any other U.S. city. After a decline last year, Gary is now on a pace to smash its all-time record.
What is it going to take to stop the babies from dying?
Johnny White's baby, Janice, turned up missing, then beaten to death this summer.
I'm tired of hearing people saying, I'm sorry for you. You know why? Because I am sorry that someone else is going to have to go through what I went through.
A community group passes out flyers urging people not to call 911 unless it is a serious emergency. There just aren't enough police to respond.
You'll get the pizza before you get the police. That's for sure.
George Rogie has had his house burglarized, his car stolen on the mean streets.
It seems as if everyone has been hit at one time or another in the last couple of years. And you just don't get any investigatory work by the Gary police. They come and make a report. That's at best.
Which is why 50 Indiana state troopers have been dispatched to Gary to back up the undermanned, overmatched local police. Indiana's governor approved sending the largest contingent of state police to Gary since the riots of the 60s.
We hope that this is an effort to stabilize the situation, get the drug dealing, the murder rate down, and then allow the local authorities to reassume control and take our place once we've done our job.
Though the state police are sure to help, at least in the short term, some say they are powerless to do anything about the real problem in Gary. That is the poverty and the blight that they say begets the drugs, which begets the crime, which begets the murder.
You ever been to Gary, Indiana?
No.
I drove through it once, and I think I needed to take an AK-47 with me.
Crack cocaine coursed through the streets, feeding gangs that carved the city into territories of violence and fear. Drug deals turned into drive-by shootings. Turf wars became everyday headlines. Residents learned to lock doors and avoid the streets after dark, but nowhere was safe. For Eugene, growing up in a house defined by abuse and a city defined by lawlessness, the boundaries between home and the streets blurred. They were both battlegrounds, shaping him in ways that would follow him into adulthood. After leaving home, Eugene descended into drugs and alcohol, seeking to numb the lasting impact of years spent in a household dominated by evil. The abuse had stunted his development. By 15, his emotional capacity barely reached that of a 10-year-old, and his practical skills aligned with a much younger child. Managing everyday life was too difficult. He could express anger and frustration, but comprehension, empathy, and connection remained beyond his grasp. Meaningful relationships were impossible. Love was foreign, companionship elusive. Rejected at home and ostracized by peers, he moved through life isolated, unmoored, and untethered. Freed from parental oversight, his behavior became progressively erratic, guided by impulses forged in chaos. Even in his earliest years of independence, it was apparent that Eugene's trajectory was veering toward a dark and dangerous path. Despite Eugene having issues with relationships, he had no problems having sex. However, he had no understanding of boundaries, and his perception of intimacy was deeply distorted. It wasn't long before he indulged in his despicable desires towards the women he had sex with. Ultimately, when a woman angered him and rage rose, he raped her. He entered adulthood unprepared for the simplest tasks of independent life. Managing money, budgeting, maintaining a household, shopping for necessities, and even safeguarding his own well-being were beyond his grasp. Socially awkward and chronically inept, he ranked among the lowest percentiles in the country, a man trapped in a world he could not navigate. In the mid-1970s, Eugene drifted into the orbit of a woman named Shelley Hall, a Streetwise operator out of Hammond, Indiana. Shelley's world was built on vice. At night, she stripped on the stage of the White Eagle Hall in East Chicago's Calumet neighborhood, and when the lights went down, she was a madam. She managed a small army of prostitutes, 13 women who hustled under her control, and she pushed drugs from her Hammond apartment, dealing poison to the same streets she fed on. Britt was intimate with Hall at 15, and continued a relationship with her into his early 20s. Hall wasn't just surviving in the underworld, she was profiting from it. A one-woman crime syndicate who knew how to squeeze every dollar out of sex and addiction. Shelley Hall's home was no shelter. It was a pit. Drugs moved in and out, bodies were bought and sold, and violence was just another part of the noise. Eugene grew up inside that chaos, and it carved something hollow into him. The filth around him didn't dull his urges, it sharpened them. By his mid-teens, he was slipping away to Gary's East Side, feeding on his compulsions. Women became the outlet for his rage, taken and discarded while the streets swallowed their screams. Inside, the storm only worsened. His mind was corrupted, heavy with madness and the poison of rejection. Violence was the only place he found release, but it never lasted. Each act left him emptier, more furious, more desperate for the next. He learned quickly that brutality was a high that faded fast, and with every crime he committed, the need only deepened. By then, he had already left a trail of rape that stretched into the dozens, unseen, unrecorded, and unpunished. Eugene was still just a shadow in the system's blind spot, free to keep hunting. Eugene would later recall one moment that stood out in the blur of his violence. His anger was boiling that day when he spotted a woman alone on a deserted street in Midtown. She didn't fight. She yielded, almost too easily, and that only fed something darker inside him. Shocked at how effortless the capture was, he dragged her into a rotting, abandoned house. Down in the basement where the air was damp and the walls crumbled, Eugene claimed her as his victim. In the basement of that abandoned house, Eugene tore the woman's clothes away and unleashed his rage on her. But what he didn't expect was her response. She stayed calm. No panic, no fight. That composure unnerved him, cooled the fire in his chest, and slowly twisted his violence into something else. In his broken mind, the attack shifted into what he believed was love. When it was over, she spoke to him softly, touched him gently, and for the first time in his life, Eugene thought he had found affection. They emerged hand in hand, walking the street like a young couple. They kissed, hugged, and to Eugene it felt real, her eyes meeting his with what he thought was tenderness. She paraded him through the neighborhood as if showing off a prize, and Eugene followed like a dog eager to please. Eventually, she guided him into an alley and pointed to a house halfway down the block. Excited, she said she wanted him to meet her family. Eugene's chest swelled at the thought. Finally, someone who saw him as more than broken, someone who might even earn him the respect his own father never gave. But the dream shattered in seconds. The door flew open and her family spilled out, a mob armed with bats, pipes, and knives. At the rear of the pack was the woman herself, her finger stretched out, pointing straight at Eugene. The tenderness vanished. Betrayal burned in its place. Then the alley erupted in motion, Eugene running for his life, the furious crowd close behind, eager to cut him down. Panic surged through him like fire as Eugene sprinted down the narrow alley, heart hammering, every shadow a threat. The mob behind him was relentless, swinging bats and pipes, their shouts slicing through the night. By some grim twist of luck, he dodged their blows, escaping with his life, but barely. Eventually, he stumbled onto a deserted block, the echoes of rage fading behind him. Alone, he finally let himself break, sobbing into the empty streets. In that moment, the boy who had already begun twisting into a predator felt the sharp sting of rejection once more. The cruel truth sank in. Even his violence couldn't conjure the affection he craved. Once again, Eugene was left abandoned, his hunger for love and control gnawing at him with bitter, unrelenting teeth. By the mid-1970s, Eugene's world had narrowed to obsession. Mountains of pornography filled his mind and apartment, seeding fantasies that clawed at him in the quiet of night. Sex became more than desire. It became a storm, a rush that twisted into disturbing dreams he had never known. Rage fed those dreams, and the dreams fed his rage, each cycle pulling him deeper. Obsession sharpened his instincts, turning curiosity into hunger, hunger into predation, and predation into reckless, escalating risk. At 17, he landed a real job at a Clark gas station, his first tether to the ordinary world. But any paycheck barely touched reality. Most of it vanished into his ever-growing pornography collection, while he fueled himself with a steady diet of weed, Mad Dog, and processed garbage. On one idle day off, boredom gnawed at him even as he watched the familiar porn. And then, the fantasy that haunted his thoughts broke through fully, a dark vision that would drive him to the most dangerous, daring act of his young life. On April 20th, 1978, Eugene wandered east along 21st Avenue in Gary, slipping across Grant Street into a silent, neglected stretch of the city. Weeds choked empty lots, and the block he entered was nearly abandoned, a ghost of a neighborhood that would one day host the small farm's apartments. A girl emerged from the shadows of summer, young, black, still in school, moving with the careless confidence of youth. Sunlight glinted off her skin, catching Eugene's attention in a way that sent a cold pulse of desire through him. As she passed, he spun around with practiced swiftness, closing the distance before she even registered danger. His hand shot forward, clamping onto her throat, cutting off her air, and silencing her startled breath before the world could catch up. Eugene's hand clamped over her mouth, his arm tightening around her neck like a vice. Alone in the quiet streets with no one to witness, the 20-year-old, 200-pound predator hauled the struggling 17-year-old through the overgrown lot he had just crossed. He moved with brutal efficiency, dragging her to the ground and pushing farther into the abandoned field south of 24th Avenue, between Arthur and Grant Street. There, the violence poured out of him unchecked. Every fight, every desperate kick and scream from the girl only fueled the storm inside him. His fists rained down, each blow heavier than the last, a dark rhythm of rage and obsession. The world around them vanished, leaving only his fury and the helplessness of his victim. "Don't look at me, or I'll punch your eyes out," he hissed, voice low and dangerous. His rage and control fused into a single motion as he tore at her clothing, stripping away shoes, pants, and undergarments with methodical force. Each movement was calculated. Every piece of fabric removed another assertion of dominance, leaving her exposed in the empty field under the weight of his fury. With each strike, Eugene's bloodlust deepened. The violence became a cruel kind of thrill, feeding the storm inside him. His fists fell again and again, punishing, overwhelming, until the girl's resistance crumbled beneath the onslaught. Her body, battered and bruised, could fight no longer. In that silence of pain and terror, she became nothing more than an object to his twisted fantasy, and he took control completely. Something in Eugene snapped completely. His gaze darkened, hollow, as if all remnants of conscience had been drained from him. In that emptiness, the line between humanity and predator vanished. He moved with relentless force, driven by a desire that was raw, unthinking, and unstoppable, leaving the girl entirely at the mercy of his fury. He raped her repeatedly. Then, while he was putting on his clothes and getting ready to leave the girl, he turned around to again. When his violent obsession had run its course, Eugene stripped the girl of a single, striking keepsake, a gold ring from her finger, an impersonal trophy of control. Then, as cold and detached as the night around him, he left her alone in the field, traumatized and trembling. She eventually found her way to the authorities, but Eugene had left no trace. His identity remained a shadow, slipping through the cracks, untouchable and unseen. 10 days later, on May 9, 1978, the victim was out with friends at a Clark gas station, unaware that the predator who had haunted her had returned to the world of the living. The attendant who approached their car was Eugene Britt, towering, 200 pounds of coiled menace. She didn't recognize his face at first, but then her eyes caught it, the stolen gold ring glinting on his pinky. Terror rushed through her. Her hands trembled as she called the police, and within moments the gas station was a trap. Officers swarmed, lights flashing, cutting off any escape. The shadow that had terrorized her now faced the law, but the memory of his violence would linger far longer than the arrest ever could. Eugene's crimes didn't go unnoticed, but the machinery of justice moved on its own schedule. Though he had already left a trail of rape and robbery in his wake, the state held back until he reached the age of 21. When the day finally came, a jury weighed the evidence of his violence and found him guilty. 2 counts of rape, 1 count of robbery. That December, the law delivered its sentence, 30 years behind the walls of Indiana State Prison at Westville. Behind those bars, Eugene was confined, but the darkness that had driven him would not be contained. The cage could hold his body, but his mind, the fury, obsession, and hunger that had shaped him, remained untamed. Prison didn't break him. It sharpened him. Behind the concrete walls and iron bars of Westville, Eugene found himself among the worst predators the system could hold. He listened, learned, and aligned himself with men capable of unspeakable acts, absorbing their lessons like fuel. The confines of incarceration did nothing to tame his hunger. His sexual urges found outlets in twisted ways, consensual or not, on anyone who crossed his path. He wasn't driven by desire for men. He was driven by dominance, by the need to control in a place where control was scarce. Halfway through his sentence in August 1993, the state released him on parole. Eugene returned to Gary, the city that had first shaped his darkness, carrying with him every lesson, every craving, every predatory impulse that prison had failed to suppress. Eugene walked out of prison not corrected, but corrupted even further. Whatever discipline the system tried to impose only hardened his appetite for violence. He was placed on probation for a year, scraping by on welfare while housed at Pendleton Reformatory near Indianapolis. Even the state stumbled in keeping track of him, released to Indianapolis while his parole officer remained in Lake County. The oversight gave him room to operate, and Eugene knew how to exploit it. Back on the streets, he fell into the hunt almost immediately. His strategy was blunt and effective. Wait, watch, strike. He lingered near vacant lots and building edges, using weeds and tall grass as cover. When a woman strayed too close, he erupted, snatching her off balance, hauling her into a spot he'd already chosen, and battering her into submission before taking what he wanted. There was nothing to interrupt him now. No system, no restraint. Only the compulsion driving him forward. Despite his stunted intellect, Eugene managed to secure employment, though he lacked any real comprehension of why work was required of him. His first position was menial, custodian at Victory Arms, a decaying apartment complex in Gary. The role afforded him a free unit, and for 16 months he occupied room 505, dutiful with rent even after leaving the post. From there, his labor drifted from one low-wage station to another, Bailey's Car Wash in Merrillville, then janitorial work at a Hardee's on the Indiana Toll Road in Portage. By December of 1994, he had abandoned Victory Arms entirely, relocating to a unit on 16th and Pierce. Outwardly, he maintained the facade of functionality, but his deficiencies bled through. Chronically tardy, indulging in childish horseplay, and accused of groping a female co-worker, Eugene demonstrated neither discipline nor understanding of professional boundaries. His capacity for processing instruction was negligible, and where clarity was absent, deceit filled the void. He lied on job applications, omitting his criminal history, and when fragments of truth did slip out, no one cared to interrogate them further. Beyond his small orbit, the city itself was disintegrating. Gary had become synonymous with collapse, gang warfare, narcotics, and bloodshed saturating its streets. In that landscape of decay, Eugene was invisible, a faceless laborer surviving on the margins. What few realized was that beneath his dull exterior, a far more insidious violence was gestating, horrors that would soon outpace even the city's already staggering reputation for brutality. By the spring of 1995, Eugene Britt's descent into carnage had reached its inevitable threshold. The first murder in his spree began almost by chance, almost by inevitability. He spotted a lone woman walking near the industrial fork where Martin Luther King Drive, Ohio, and Tennessee streets fractured into separate paths, just behind the looming bulk of Indiana Sugars. The geography of that place was perfect for an ambush. Rail lines cutting through weeds, blind corners where one could vanish and reappear in an instant, a landscape designed for predators. Britt rode past her on his bicycle, lungs heaving, eyes locked. She scarcely noticed. Then, with calculated haste, he veered toward the rail tracks, pedaling furiously until he burst out onto the adjoining street, reappearing directly in her path. He stood there, breathing hard as though the air itself carried menace. She glanced, but dismissed him. He coasted nearer, feigning casualness, and asked, "Where you going?" A car rolled by, its brief presence offering her a sense of safety. But the moment it disappeared, the atmosphere changed. Instinct stirred in her. Something in his eyes, his posture, made her body recoil before her mind could place it. That instinct came too late. Britt lunged, clamping his hand around her throat, and hauling her off the road into a hidden recess by the tracks. Rage guided him more than hunger. He struck her again and again, fists hammering until she reeled beneath the weight of his blows. Still, she resisted. She clenched her body, refused him the access he demanded, her defiance only feeding his fury. Each refusal of her body to yield, poured gasoline on the fire in him. Her stubbornness did not break him, it unchained him. He forced himself on her and had his way with her. Then he choked her again, his hands clamped around her throat, thick and unyielding. Knuckles whitened as he squeezed, jerking her violently until her feet scraped the dirt in wild, useless kicks. The sounds of the street faded beneath the ragged gasps being forced from her windpipe. A sharp tang of iron filled the air where blood pooled from her split lip, mixing with the sour musk of sweat and weeds crushed beneath their struggle. Her eyes rolled back, and her body slackened. He felt the fight die inside her, like watching a flame sputter out in the wind. And in that silence, with only his own heaving breath left to break it, Eugene acted. He tore at her, frantic and animal, convinced that each stolen second was on the verge of collapsing. The urgency wasn't desire, it was desperation, the compulsion of a predator who knew his time would always be running out. Her chest heaved shallowly, her eyelids fluttering open, and for a brief moment her eyes locked onto his face. That gaze was enough to unravel him. The recognition, the threat of being remembered, it was intolerable. Rage overtook him like fire licking dry timber. His hands lunged for her throat again, squeezing until bone ground against tendon, until her final gasps broke into silence. He shook her with a fury that bordered on hysteria, grinding the last remnants of life from her body. When she went limp for good, his fury only deepened into something colder, more grotesque. He stripped her bare, dragging her corpse to a patch of ground he deemed safer, hidden deeper from the world. There, he violated her again, her stillness feeding his delusion of control. When he was done, he gathered himself as if nothing had happened, returning to his bicycle, pedaling off toward work with the calm routine of a man running errands. Her name was Maxine Walker. The city swallowed her absence whole, and it wasn't until the cold December air crept in that her remains were finally discovered, long after Britt had erased her from his conscience. Early May 1995. Beneath the concrete sprawl of the I-80 flyover, where the roar of traffic drowns out human cries, a 13-year-old girl was seized from the railroad tracks. A hand clamped around her throat, dragging her into the shadows beneath the expressway. There, amid the filth and silence, she was raped and left to stagger back into the world, alive but shattered. Her survival the cruelest part of the ordeal. May 9th, 1995. The next victim did not escape. That morning, school children stumbled upon the body of Arlinda Lois Smith, 46. She lay supine and exposed, stripped of every garment, her flesh marked by brutal blows from a blunt instrument. Her neck bore the unmistakable evidence of savage force, a silent testimony to how her final breaths had been stolen. What remained was not merely a corpse, but the stark imprint of calculated violence, discarded in the open as if to taunt whoever might find her. May 16, 1995. Sarah Harrington, 32, was discovered lifeless along 8300 East Dunes Highway. At first glance, her death was misfiled as natural, though the tableau whispered otherwise. Trousers stripped away, her shirt cinched cruelly around her throat. What the official record sought to sanitize, the scene itself betrayed. This was not the quiet exit of failing flesh, but the aftermath of intrusion and violence, staged beneath the indifferent sprawl of the highway. June 24, 1995. Nikita Moore was found. In a desolate field off the 2000 block of West 15th Avenue, Nikita's remains surfaced in partial decay, her body clothed, save for a lone sock still clinging to one foot. Her garments had been scattered, later found atop a nearby derelict building as if cast aside with contempt. At first, no cause of death could be discerned from her decomposed state. Only later did the truth surface. The air had been forced from her lungs, her life choked out by strangulation. July 18, 1995. 41-year-old Deborah McHenry was last seen alive between 8 and 10 p.m. on July 17th. By morning, her body lay abandoned behind a garage in the 2900 block of West 21st Avenue, hidden among weeds and shadows. She was face up, naked from the waist down, her flesh bearing the signatures of brutality, her skull marked by blows, her throat crushed by strangling hands. The discovery was made not by detectives but by the unsuspecting homeowner, who stepped into his alley to find a scene of desecration waiting in the overgrowth. August 13, 1995. At dawn, the body of Michelle Lynette Burns, 27, was discovered in a barren lot beside 2019 Broadway, a building once a car dealership, now reduced to a hollowed ruin. A prostitute by trade, Michelle became Gary's 77th homicide of the year, a grim statistic rendered flesh and bone. She had been strangled, her final breath stolen in silence. When found, she was still clad in Levi jean shorts, a black and white short-sleeved shirt, and aqua Reebok sneakers. Her everyday attire frozen into evidence, each item a reminder that she had been alive mere hours before. August 22nd, 1995. 9 days later, horror struck again. That morning, Sarah Lynn Pollson, only 8 years old, rode her bicycle in the quiet lot of a church in Portage. Within an hour, innocence was torn away. A passerby walking her dog stumbled upon her small frame in the woods nearby, face down beneath the shadow of a pine tree, her body stripped, strangled, and defiled. Her sandals and bicycle lay discarded not far from the scene, mute relics of a childhood abruptly extinguished. September 1st, 1995. In the fading light of evening, Betty Jean Askew, 51, stood in her alley, surveying her backyard. Out of the shadows, Eugene emerged suddenly, his voice cutting the air with false familiarity. "Hey, how you doing?" Alarm flared in Betty's chest. She turned to retreat, but hesitation sealed her fate. Only days earlier, she had voiced her unease about a neglected property nearby. "I want that grass cut down. It's frightening," she told her sister, Augusta Abram. "Someone could be killed there." Her words would prove grimly prophetic. When Betty failed to appear for her shift at St. Margaret's Hospital, her sister and former boyfriend, Albert Smith, filed a missing persons report. Her brothers soon discovered her back door ajar, the light still burning inside, an abandoned scene of ordinary life interrupted. Driven by dread, Smith scoured the empty lots near her home. It was there, in an overgrown yard just 2 lots north of her house on the 500 block of Harrison Street, that he found her. Betty's body lay in decomposition, her clothing strewn across the weeds, her bra twisted cruelly over her head. She had become Gary's 85th homicide of the year, her end swallowed by the very blight she had feared. From May through September 1995, Gary, Indiana was transformed into a necropolis hiding in plain view. More than a dozen women and girls were ravished, strangled, and discarded. Some left clinging tenuously to life, most abandoned to decomposition. The majority were black, their remains strewn across the city's neglected margins. Weed-choked lots, alleys drowned in overgrowth, derelict parking expanses, and wooded enclaves where the very architecture of blight seemed to conspire with predation. The homicides bore a chilling uniformity: throttling, exposure, violation. Each crime scene echoing the same malignant cadence. The pattern was not coincidence, but signature. Yet city leaders disavowed the specter. Pressed repeatedly, Mayor Barnes and the Gary Police Department repudiated the notion of a serial killer at large. They rationalized the carnage as statistical noise, a byproduct of urban collapse, insisting there was no empirical tether between the deaths. In truth, law enforcement was fracturing beneath the sheer velocity of bloodshed. The mid-90s inundated Gary with unprecedented homicide counts, fueled by gang rivalries and narcotic wars. The police force was emaciated, undermanned, overextended, and perpetually castigated for its inadequacies. The dysfunction metastasized to such an extent that the National Guard and Indiana State Police were summoned, their deployment a gesture without precedent. Troops materialized on street corners in fatigues, but their mandate was cosmetic. They carried neither the authority to shoot nor to arrest. For a fleeting interval, their presence pacified the tempo of violence, but they could not remain. Once withdrawn, entropy reclaimed the streets, and the women continued to die. To some, these murders were mere symptomatic effusions of a city ravaged by poverty, narcotics, and abandonment. But keener instincts discerned something more insidious, an intelligence moving through the dereliction, exploiting it as camouflage. From the hollows of dilapidated homes and the thickets of urban wilderness, murder itself seemed to emanate, an unseen predator harvesting beneath the shroud of civic decay. August 22nd, 1995. The crime that finally unraveled Eugene Britt's anonymity was the murder of 8-year-old Sarah Pollson. Britt himself never elaborated in detail on what he did to her that day, only admitting later with chilling brevity that he felt ashamed. That morning, Britt had been at work at Hardee's, where his shift unraveled in a cascade of petty infractions and mounting suspicion. He was accused of eating food he hadn't purchased, of horseplay, even of falsifying his application. His 1978 rape conviction surfaced, and management decided to sever him from the staff. Whatever the precise trigger, his manager, Ms. Hubbard, ordered him off the premises. Yet Britt did not immediately leave. Routine kept him orbiting the property like a moth to flame. For nearly 40 minutes, he lingered on his bicycle in the parking lot until security was called to drive him away. Britt finally pedaled off, still clad in his green Hardee's uniform. Only 11 minutes later, he passed the Central Avenue Church of God, where he saw her, Sarah, pedaling a pink and purple bicycle with white wheels across the empty church lot. Her house was just across the street. That morning, her mother, Patricia, was at work. Her father, Daniel, out of town. Her brothers were meant to be watching her, but they had slipped back inside, leaving the girl outside, unguarded. To Britt, that was all that mattered. She was small, isolated, vulnerable. Witnesses in the neighborhood would later recall the strange, unmistakable sight: an imposing man in a Hardee's uniform, astride a blue 10-speed, coaxing a child toward the wooded patch behind the church. Some watched from cars, others from nearby homes. His green shirt, his size, his bicycle, all details that made him conspicuous even in fleeting glimpses. What transpired in the woods remains mercifully obscured. By Britt's own admission, he coaxed Sarah inside under the guise of play, touched her, and tried to silence her with persuasion. When she screamed, his violence erupted. His fury was lethal, even against a child. Not long after, he was seen again, emerging from the church lot on his bicycle, heading west down Central Avenue. Another witness spotted him further along, near Warwick Street. Sarah's discovery came within the hour. Accounts differ. Some say a passerby grew suspicious after watching the man in the green uniform vanish into the trees. Others insist it was a neighbor's dog that first sounded the alarm, barking furiously near the place of concealment. Regardless, what awaited beneath the canopy was the same: a small body, left under an oak tree. Sarah had been strangled and sexually violated, her short life extinguished in the space of minutes. The murder of little Sarah Pollson sent Portage into collective panic. Parents whispered of a serial child killer in their midst, though no evidence yet substantiated such a claim. What no one fathomed was that Sarah's death was tethered to the same unseen hand that had already strangled women in Gary's shadows. Eugene Britt had been seen. His description was relayed to police, and for once they moved with urgency. While investigators quietly pursued this lead, the city of Portage threw itself into public grief and support. Midwest Steel posted a $15,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Restaurants launched fundraising drives. Neighbors organized candlelight vigils. Sarah's death reverberated beyond Indiana, eliciting a nationwide outpouring. So many gifts and donations poured in that the Pollson family diverted much of it to charity. But the disparity was stark. No such mobilization had followed the murders of women and girls in Gary, just miles away. To the public eye, Gary's tragedies were quarantined, dismissed as if they belonged to another world, an expendable one. Crowds gathered at Sarah's crime scene. Parents brought their own children, warning them about strangers as they lingered among the mourners. Expectant mothers stood in hushed conversation with the Pollsons' neighbors, using the horror as a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, the staff at Hardee's could not shake their unease. The manager, Ms. Hubbard, and the security guard remembered Eugene, the sullen employee they had just expelled minutes before Sarah vanished. On instinct, Hubbard called police. There, officers learned about the restaurant's distinctive green uniforms and connected the description to Britt. The lead was kept quiet, shared discreetly with Gary detectives. Together, they agreed Eugene must be watched. But Britt complicated surveillance. He was homeless, a drifter whose lodgings shifted from alleys to shelters. At the time, he was said to occasionally stay with his sister, Brenda, though records are unclear. After Sarah's murder, he found refuge at the Prayer House Deliverance Temple on 5th Avenue, barely 600 yards from the home of one of his next victims, Betty Askew. Inside the shelter, Britt cloaked himself in piety. He listened to gospel music, thumbed the Bible, and gained the trust of Reverend Clyde Smith, who mistook his quiet reserve for gentleness. To the Reverend and others, Eugene seemed almost meek, a man marked by hardship, not by savagery. They saw no rapist, no killer. Yet beneath that fragile disguise, guilt had begun to corrode him. It festered, gnawing like an untreated infection, an inner cancer that would not let him rest. In the first week of September, investigators began pressing Eugene Britt about his whereabouts on the day Sarah Pollson was murdered. Portage police had secured a key piece of evidence, the Green Hardy's uniform shirt worn by Eugene that morning. However, they didn't have enough evidence to hold him. By September 14th, Eugene had descended further into self-destruction. He consumed a fifth of liquor, 3 40-ounce beers, a pound of cannabis, and a palmful of sleeping pills. Staggering through the dilapidated streets of East Gary, he stumbled upon an abandoned house. Inside, he scavenged wire hangers and fashioned them into a crude metal noose. He looped one end around his neck, the other secured to the iron bars of a security window. Sitting down, he let the weight of his body tighten the loop. The metal bit into his throat. Darkness closed in. Eventually, he blacked out. When he awoke, vomiting and still enmeshed in a drugged alcoholic haze, he found himself near 4th and Virginia, wandering east toward Miller. A South Shore freight train emerged in the distance. Without hesitation, he hurled himself in front of it. The locomotive did not claim him, but it tossed him hundreds of feet, leaving him battered. His right leg was torn open, mangled by the wheels, and the train crew hit emergency brakes before rushing to investigate. Eugene, groaning and semi-conscious, crawled to a nearby fence and began to climb. It was at that moment 13 Gary Police Department officers arrived, guns drawn. They commanded him down, but shock overtook him, and he collapsed unconscious. Eugene was transported to Methodist Hospital, where he spent a day receiving treatment for his injuries. The train incident left permanent damage. A cane would be necessary for the rest of his life. And in that chaotic, self-inflicted collision with death, his decades-long career of rape and murder came to an abrupt and final end. After his near-fatal encounter with the train, Eugene Britt made his way to his sister Darlwyn Britt's residence. When she saw his battered body and began asking questions, Eugene's volatility erupted into a violent confrontation, severe enough that Darlwyn called the police on her own brother. Before officers arrived, he had vanished from her home. Darlwyn was later questioned by investigators, providing them with the Green Hardy's shirt Eugene had worn the day of Sarah Pollson's murder. Eugene returned a short time later, accompanied by volunteers from the Prayer House Deliverance Temple, retrieving his belongings. Among them was a startling discovery, a bag containing nearly 40 pornographic videotapes. Eugene claimed he had lost roughly half of his collection, insisting that pornography was the only media he consumed, if he consumed anything at all. The volunteers found it strange, but were unaware of his true crimes, and the revelation went unreported. Back at Prayer House, now physically impaired, Eugene resumed confiding in Reverend Clyde Smith. This time, the revelations were far darker than those he had shared previously. Reverend Smith would later recall being deeply unsettled by Eugene's 1978 rape conviction, and by the man's obsessive preoccupation with women. In Eugene's distorted worldview, any woman he found attractive automatically reciprocated desire, a notion that underlined a profound lack of empathy. Shelter volunteers noted a duality in his temperament, superficially polite, calm, even unassuming, yet with an explosive anger that could ignite over trivial provocations. His demeanor fascinated the staff, but they sensed they were dealing with a deeply disturbed individual. Reverend Smith described Eugene's fury as palpable, his pain nearly constant, gnawing at him like a living wound. Meanwhile, Portage police had picked up his trail. His train incident had ensured he was now firmly on law enforcement's radar. Information gathered by Portage PD was quietly shared with the Gary Police Department, and officers quickly realized that Eugene's mobility was constrained. He could not easily vanish. Surveillance was established at Prayer House, with officers posing as social workers and maintaining telephone contact to monitor his movements. Britt, unsuspecting, fell squarely into their trap. By late October, Reverend Clyde Smith had begun to suspect that Eugene Britt might be linked to the Sarah Pollson case. Repeated cryptic phone calls to the Prayer House Deliverance Temple gnawed at him. One evening, he confronted Eugene, asking if he was fleeing from the authorities. Eugene denied it. Still, Smith's intuition refused to be silenced. He clung to the hope that his instincts were wrong, that his sanctuary was not harboring a child killer. By the beginning of November, law enforcement had coordinated a strike. On November 4th, Eugene's 38th birthday, Portage and Gary police raided the church. Eugene offered no resistance as officers took him into custody. The arrest was made possible, in part, by the smallest of details. Sarah herself had fought briefly and left her mark on her killer. Fibers from Eugene's Green Hardy's shirt were trapped beneath her fingernails. Investigators then secured the uniform from his sister, Brenda Britt, allowing them to tie Eugene conclusively to the murder. DNA evidence would later cement the connection. Under interrogation, Eugene confessed not only to Sarah's murder, but to 10 additional killings. Most had occurred in Gary, and while police had discovered the victims, many deaths had been misclassified. Some were recorded as natural causes, others remained undetermined. With his lawyer and Reverend Smith present, Eugene divulged crimes previously unknown to investigators. He spoke with unnerving clarity, recounting murder scenes, addresses, and the precise locations of bodies yet to be recovered. 3 more female victims would be located before the close of 1995, their deaths now linked to his confessions. Eugene's revelations unveiled a meticulous predator, operating in plain sight, yet cloaked by a combination of chaos, societal neglect, and law enforcement overload. His memory was precise, photographic. Every victim, every alleyway, every abandoned lot cataloged in chilling detail, exposing the full scope of his reign of terror. By the time Eugene Victor Britt was ushered into the judicial arena, his notoriety had already metastasized through the very marrow of Northwest Indiana. The man who had methodically stalked, violated, and annihilated the lives of women and girls across Gary and Portage was finally confronted by the inexorable apparatus of justice. His trial was not merely a legal proceeding, it was the denouement of a predator who had exploited the fissures of society for decades. The initial theater of contention centered upon his mental state. Forensic psychiatrists and defense attorneys clashed over the question of competency. The defense endeavored to portray Britt as a man fractured by intellectual deficits and a lifetime of exposure to violence, suggesting he was criminally insane. Yet psychiatric evaluation contradicted them. Britt was lucid, aware, and capable of apprehending the nature and consequences of his acts. Nevertheless, the court recognized his cognitive limitations, mitigating the extremes of his culpability in sentencing, but doing nothing to diminish the gravity of his transgressions. In October 2006, Britt entered pleas of guilty but mentally ill for the serial murders of Nikita Moore, Tanya Dunlap, Maxine Walker, Betty Askew, Michelle Burns, and Deborah McHenry, along with the rape of a 13-year-old girl. In the austere, fluorescent-lit courtroom, he offered a rare and stark articulation of contrition. "I'm sorry for what I did. I ask for forgiveness from the families and the victims." The confession, though ephemeral, was a grim acknowledgement of atrocities that had long defied accountability. On May 24, 1996, the court sentenced Eugene Britt to life in prison plus 100 years for the murder of 8-year-old Sarah Pollson. On November 3, 2006, the court imposed the following sentence to Eugene Britt for the additional murders: 245 additional years in prison, to run concurrently with his prior life sentence, and the 100 years for the 1995 murder of Sarah Pollson. Britt was consigned to Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, a permanent edifice embodying both retribution and containment. The trial of Eugene Britt underscored the stark dualities of human depravity. A man capable of meticulous, premeditated horror, yet bounded by intellectual impairment. A predator who could articulate remorse while simultaneously cataloging unspeakable atrocities. It was a grim testament to the tenacity of justice, the fragility of societal protections, and the inescapable consequences awaiting those who exploit both.